whatever happens in Iran, Epstein does not go away, and it should not go away, because justice for the victims, it isn't here yet, but it should still be pursued.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we're speaking about this potential imminent attack on Iran from the US and Israel's side. There's a lot more stuff that's also happened with the Epstein files. So I'm bringing in my guest today, which is Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin. And just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on the Trump Report YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Scott, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Good afternoon, Maddie. Let's see what we can do.
Well, the big story of the day is, of course, this report from Axios. It's been also corroborated by some military analysts that say the US and Israel are preparing for a full-scale war in the Middle East that could last a couple of weeks. So a Trump advisor has told Axios that the boss, being Trump, is getting fed up. Some people around him warn him against going to war with Iran, but I think there is a 90% chance we see action in the next few weeks. I mean, what was your reaction to this?
My reaction to it is psychological pressure, because let's put all the pieces together in terms of facts and then build up in terms of what might be happening. Look, it's a no-brainer that the U.S. has a force off the coast of Iran to launch military attacks in the sense of aerial attacks, mainly with missiles and warplanes coming off of the carriers, right? They're there. They're out there. It's a no-brainer that Israel would love to have another pop, or at least the Netanyahu government would love to have another pop at Iran after that inconclusive 12-day war that they had last June. So, I'm not a military analyst, political analyst, and I'll defer to what they say about the capabilities that are there. But I think it's straightforward that if Israel and the United States want to go to war with Iran, they can do so, at least in the sense of an aerial war. I mean, let's make clear, we're not talking about a ground-based invasion into Iran, right? Which raises questions about what your end game is, but I'll hold that to the side. The reason why I say, all right, politically, we need to balance off against that is, well, wait a minute. The U.S. and Iran have just come out of the second set of their current talks. Now, these are the ones that were in Geneva earlier this week with real estate developer Steve Witkoff, who seems to be everywhere right now, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in indirect talks with an Iranian delegation led by the foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi. Now, when they come out of those talks, Araghchi says, look, we got a good path. We've got a way forward, effectively saying these are talks about talks. So we've sort of defined the agenda where we can follow up on this. Okay, you might say, well, the Iranians would say that because they're playing for time. They don't want to be attacked. Fair enough. But American officials said, okay, the Iranians are going to come back to us in about 4 weeks with that effectively agenda. And they're basically where their positions are on that agenda. And we're talking about areas like nuclear enrichment, whether the Iranians are willing to discuss ballistic missiles, which the answer to that is probably no, talking about where Iran is positioned versus its so-called proxy forces, its allies in the Middle East. Again, the Iranians will probably say that's not on the table. Where we are in terms of sanctions and what Iran expects regarding sanctions, and where we are in terms of verification, inspection of Iranian facilities through the International Atomic Energy Agency, right? So you would think the Iranians would define their positions on that, the Americans would define their positions on that, and then they come back after 4 weeks. So the U.S. officials are giving out 2 different messages. They go to Barak Ravid, who is with Axios, and Barak Ravid, quite often, American and Israeli officials will use him to get their message out. So they go to Ravid. They also have gone to CBS News, the U.S. outlet, who overnight are saying that the U.S. military could strike as early as Saturday, right? So I'm going to pull all this together, Maddie. All I can do is give you the parameters. I can't predict what is going to happen, but the parameters are here. This is a sort of Damocles. That is that American officials will brief various folks, and the Israelis probably as well, telling the Iranians, you do what we want us to do or you're going to get hit, right? And by saying that, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to carry out the military attacks, but it means they get into a stronger position. They get more leverage in the political negotiations.
And let's break down where we're at and how we got there. So I think one of the biggest questions that is really circulating political military analysts, as well as just everyday pundits online, is whether an attack on Iran, a potential attack on Iran, is because Trump wants to overthrow the Iranian regime or because of their nuclear weapons program. And even if it's both, what as of late has caused this US-Israeli attack on Iran that is now potentially days away?
Well, again, there's always multiple motives, and that sort of adds to the challenge of interpreting this. Let's start off with a fundamental here, which is that the U.S. and the Islamic Republic have been at odds with each other since 1979. We've had close to almost 50 years of this. We know that in recent years, there's been a fluctuating relationship between the U.S. and Iran, that in the Obama and Biden administrations, there was the possibility of reaching agreement. In fact, there was an agreement over Iran's nuclear program in 2015, which did limit it. But we know that Trump 1.0, the first term, scrapped the agreement and went for maximum economic pressure to break Iran economically. Now, at that point, coming out of Trump 1.0, you have to say, look, are they really looking at limiting Iran's nuclear program, where Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, or are they really looking at using economic pressure for regime change? Is that what they're doing? And their rhetoric is kind of muddled on this. At times they'll talk about getting rid of the regime. At times they talk about how the nuclear program is the priority. What I would say is that both are in play here. That there are some Trump officials, and indeed this is in the military, this is in the intel services, this is in state, who would like to have a defined limit on Iran's nuclear program. But you had that. You had that in 2015. The Trump folks got rid of this. So there are some Trump officials who want something more than that. Those Trump officials who want something more than that, in kind of a vague way, we can get rid of the supreme leader, we can get rid of the Revolutionary Guards, they tend to intersect with elements in the Iranian diaspora who, for understandable reasons, would like to get rid of the regime. It's not a very nice regime. A lot of their relatives have suffered under it. A lot of them left Iran because of this regime. The problem here is that those two then compete with the third agenda, which is Donald Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize. So therefore, he wants to still negotiate with the Iranians while threatening the Iranians, which take place. But I want to go a step beyond that, Maddie. The problem for me is not just this kind of confusion of motives of where you want to land. It doesn't match up with the internal Iranian situation for two reasons. The first is it doesn't support the protesters. And we need to make this clear. Now I'm going to go full disclosure here. Before 2009 and the regime's repression of the mass protest, after that manipulated election, before 2009, I worked in Iran. I had a position, an adjunct position with Tehran University. I was able to go to the country twice, two other times rejected, but twice went there for weeks, worked with students, worked with academics, met a lot of people on the sidelines, had some very full and frank discussions quietly. And I've got many friendships that have come out of that link with Iran. My reading of that, both from those personal connections and this more broadly, reading the evidence is, Iranians don't feel they'll be supported by an American military attack to get rid of the regime, right? They're going to endure a lot of pain and a lot of hardship, but they don't think this will necessarily crack the regime. If anything, the opposite. Go back to June, last June 2025, 12-day Israeli war on the regime. A lot of Iranians want that regime gone. But as soon as the Israelis attacked, what the regime does is they go to the Iranian people and go, Israel and the US are attacking your nation. Not just your system, your nation. They're attacking you, your friends, your communities. They're attacking you. And the regime is able to shift the discussion from their repression to the US and Israel attacking the country, and they rally support that way. And go back to last June and you will see the fact that the regime survived those 12 days, and they survived it with a lot of support. Now, here we are, just weeks after the bloodiest repression of protest in the Islamic Republic's history. Thousands of people killed, possibly tens of thousands. You all know that story, right? We have the regime trying to cover up the fact that they killed these thousands, tens of thousands of people. And how are they doing it? They're saying that the protests were directed by the US and Israel. If you go in and you attack the regime, you give them legitimacy for that explanation. That's point blank. And the second point here is just simply attacking the regime from the air doesn't necessarily crack it. Israel wiped out most of the military leadership last June. They took out more than 20 senior military leaders. They took out some political leaders. They tried to hit the president and wanted to hit the supreme leader. Despite all of those attacks, the regime held. Because, and I don't like this, I wish it wasn't this way, the supreme leader's office, the political institutions, the Revolutionary Guards, and the besieged paramilitary still all work with each other. There's no fractures within that regime. And again, being full and frank with viewers, I'm going to say this. The idea that the late Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi, could come in and be like a savior for Iran, that may be an idea amongst some in the Iranian diaspora. And we saw big rallies that he called for overseas earlier this week. But within Iran, it is not clear that most Iranians want that type of leader parachuted in, because not only is it a question of the late Shah, his legacy, which is very mixed, it's also a question of what happened in Iraq in 2003. When the Americans tried to parachute somebody in to lead Iraq, an Iraqi who had not been in the country since 1958, Ahmed Chalabi, and it didn't go well.
Let's talk about last June. Scott, you and I spoke when these attacks happened, but this week the US has been demanding that Iran give up its nuclear program and agree to not enrich any more uranium. But when the US struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites in June, Trump then stated that Iran's nuclear program had been obliterated. So I think that's why a lot of people are confused. Why would we go to war in Iran when you said their nuclear program was obliterated last year?
Yeah, but since when has Donald Trump been consistent? Why is anybody surprised about this? Look,
because I'm going to interrupt and say, because this is the stuff that he owes it to his constituents to be honest about.
Donald Trump don't owe no one anything regarding honesty, at least in the head of Donald Trump. You and I might say that as responsible analysts, as journalists. We might say it as responsible people. Donald Trump does not think of any obligation other than to himself. And let us put that down there. And then, as always with Trump, you got to go to the facts. Look, the Israelis hit certain Iranian nuclear facilities. They could not hit one of the key facilities, which is built into the side of a mountain called Fordow. This is where a lot of the uranium enrichment takes place. This is where the uranium is enriched to 60%, not military grade, but potentially it could be further enriched to military grade. It took the Americans to hit that with the bunker buster bombs. The Iranians were kind of being coy on how much damage they took, but eventually I think it has come out, which is that the damage to Iran's nuclear facilities set back their enrichment program by at least months, right? Whether it's more than months and years is an open question, but it did not completely remove the program, right? It did not stop Iran's capabilities from rebuilding the program. Here we are months later, and we don't know. And the reason why we don't know is because the Trump people walked out of the 2015 agreement. Iran has blocked inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. We don't know clearly at what stage they are at with enrichment. But I think what we can say quite firmly is that simply going in and attacking the nuclear facilities is not going to deal with the longer term issue. Because you can go in and hit the facilities again and again, And if a country still wants nuclear enrichment, they will rebuild. And that's been the lesson since last June. Now, there's only two ways out of that, which gets us back to possible motives. You either get a regime in place or a government in place or a system in place that does not want to pursue nuclear enrichment, so regime change, or you negotiate with the current regime to get an agreement to limit enrichment, which is what we had. It is what we had in 2015, but the Trump people ripped it up. The position we are now from a political point of view, a negotiating point of view, is that the Trump people say publicly, zero enrichment, no enrichment at all. The Iranians say, wait a minute, we enrich uranium for civilian purposes, and they do. They enrich uranium for medical isotopes. They enrich it for fuel for their reactors. There are civilian uses for nuclear fuel. The Iranians say other countries, many other countries have nuclear enrichment for civilian purposes. Why will you not allow us to have this? We as a country are advanced enough that we should be able to have this. This was restated in a much ruder form by the Supreme Leader earlier this week, which is, we aren't giving this up, and if you attack us, we've got missiles. It's like, oh, great, that helps. The landing point here, and again, without defending the regime, cannot stand the regime, want to put it out there, but the landing point here on the nuclear issue is to go to an agreement where Iran is enabled to enrich back to around about 3.67%, not 60%, not 20, 3.67, and you have verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency. There is a glimmer that the Iranians would accept this. President Pezeshkian, on the day of the Geneva talks this week, after they concluded, put emphasis on saying, we are looking at an agreement in which we have our program, but we are looking at verification. And verification is code for International Atomic Energy Agency, whose head met the Iranian foreign minister this week, possibly to discuss the possibilities of that renewed verification.
So what we know just in terms of where we're at from the US side. So we know that the US Armada now consists of 2 aircraft carriers, 12 warships, hundreds of fighter jets. There's been multiple air defense systems taken over there. 150 US military cargo ships flights have moved weapons and ammunition to the Middle East. Another 50 fighter jets in 24 hours, including F-35s, F-22s, and F-16. So, I mean, while Trump hasn't publicly said that he's going ahead with this plan, it seems as if there's indication that this is where the US will move, Scott. But I want to get your thoughts on the Supreme Leader's response to this. So Ali Khamenei a few days ago responding to these threats, but also the fact that the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, is currently sailing across the Atlantic. He said they constantly say we've sent an aircraft carrier towards Iran. Okay, of course an aircraft carrier is a dangerous device, but more dangerous than the carrier is the weapon that can send it to the bottom of the sea, which was quite a humorous response from him. And then a few days ago, Iranian reports say that Khamenei issued this warning to Trump. He said, the strongest army in the world can sometimes be slapped so hard it cannot get up. I mean, it seems as if whether or not these threats are real, I wonder if Trump and Netanyahu's threats of imminent action in Iran are strong enough, or have they cried wolf too many times that the Supreme Leader is not even taking them seriously?
Look, this is the Supreme Leader's only option. He's not, like, a Supreme Leader shows weakness, then you've got questions of elements within his system, the military, especially the Revolutionary Guards, the intelligence services, even elements in his office. They go, hey, mate, you really up to this? Look, there's a fundamental here, Maddie, which is beyond all of this, which is that the hardliners in each country feed off of each other. It's almost like one of those really horrible domestic relationships where the two partners hate each other, but they kind of have to coexist with each other. And that is, Trump and his ilk go, We're going to hit you. Ooh, we're going to get you. Here we come. And then the supreme leader goes before his people, we will show the Americans what will be done. We will defeat them. We'll defeat the Israelis. And as he put it earlier this week, we will vanquish this morally corrupt nation. And so they just simply keep shouting at each other like two guys in a pub, right? And they try to get support by doing that, right? So Trump tries to get support from his people by looking tough. The Supreme Leader tries to get, support by looking tough as well. Here's where it gets serious, Maddie, and we need to talk about it getting serious. Look, if the Americans and the Israelis go back in and attack, what the Iranians signaled earlier this week is they had military drills in the Straits of Hormuz. Straits of Hormuz is 1/5 of the world's oil passes through there. 1/5, right? When they had the military drills in the Straits of Hormuz, they partially closed the straits. Do you think it was a coincidence that they had those military exercises this week to say, oh, we have to close the Straits of Hormuz? Absolutely not. We also know that the Iranians do have some pretty advanced missiles, and we know those missiles caused a bit of pain to the Israelis last June. Certainly didn't break the Israelis, certainly wasn't as much damage as the Israelis inflicted, but it was still significant. Now, what if the Iranians are not just simply using missiles and arms, not just against Israel? What if they decide to fire against those American ships? What if they decide to fire against American troops who have been in Syria, who've been in Iraq, who are in the Gulf states, right? In other words, once you launch this military attack, you can't be sure that the Iranian chest thumping is just bluff. You can't be sure. And that's why, Maddie, and you can tell I'm still hanging out as being skeptical as whether we get more than demonstration strikes. In other words, whether we get a full-scale assault, and that's because of the Gulf states. If you get a full-scale assault, and by that I mean not just attacking one or two military or nuclear facilities, you go all out against the regime, then it's the Gulf states who are in the firing line if this goes basically pear-shaped across the entire region. And I think it's going to be key to watch. Saudi, UAE, Kuwait, Oman, are they continuing to tell the Americans we do not want this? Or are they going to say, look, we're going to stand aside. Trump's going to do this. Let's just see how extensive the attack is, and then we'll pick up the pieces wherever they land.
But Scott, the other thing is if Trump does order this potential attack and it leads to a full-scale war in the Middle East, how can he do this without congressional approval?
That's an easy one for Trump. He don't care. How could he go in and assemble, again, a fleet with the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is now moving to Iran? How could he assemble that fleet off the coast of Venezuela, then go in and kidnap Nicolas Maduro, violating international law? How could he do that without congressional approval? Well, he could do that just simply because he went down to do it and created various excuses. We're getting drugs. You're not, but that was the excuse. Then we're going to liberate Venezuelans. Well, not quite, but yeah. And then it's like, oh, we're going to be able to kidnap this guy and somehow this is all just and appropriate. Well, no. Look, he never went to Congress for any of that. Okay. And certainly the Democrats and a few Republicans afterwards said, oh, you really should have consulted us. And Trump and his folks went, yeah, we're not.
I mean, they're saying it online right now, Scott, because they're obviously not wanting to go down exactly what you're saying. They don't want to go down the exact same path as what happened in Venezuela. And so they're saying you need congressional approval. But I want to read out this tweet for you from 2013 that's been resurfacing, which it reads from Trump's account. It reads, remember what I previously said, Obama will someday attack Iran in order to show how tough he is. I mean, does the same apply now?
Yes, because Donald Trump has always projected. When Donald Trump says, there are people out there who are going to rig elections, guess why? Because Donald Trump would like to rig elections. When he says, there are people out there who would like to be president for life, yeah, because he wants to be president for life. Yeah, the fact of the matter is, Donald Trump is not burdened by consistency. I repeat this. I also will repeat something else, which is the biggest inconsistency. You remember, I'm old enough to remember when he wanted to be called the president of peace. Hey, I'm old enough to remember when he was given international football's FIFA Peace Prize at the World Cup draw earlier this year. So where's the president of peace now, right? And the fact here is that on the same day I'm talking to you about the fact there might be war in Iran, guess which group is convening? Oh yeah, the Board of Peace, nominally chaired by Donald Trump. Donald Trump has never read George Orwell. I'm willing to put the House and the kids on that. Donald Trump has probably never seen a movie based on George Orwell. But Donald Trump lives George Orwell every day. War is peace. Ignorance is knowledge. Every day he goes out there and simply bends reality in his own mind for himself first, and then tries to bend it for the rest of us. So all you can do, Maddie, is simply say, look, Donald Trump's rhetoric is not what we have to base this on. We have to base this going beyond Trump on what other officials are looking at, on what other countries in the region are looking at, and what the Iranians are looking at. And from my point of view, remember that the priority, first and foremost, are the Iranians. Just think of how much they've gone through in recent weeks. And here's the prospect that they're going to get a world of pain unleashed on them again.
Scott, we always say with Trump, actions speak louder than words. Don't go off what he says when he's on a debate stage, etc., etc. But if the US goes into war, if there's troops on the ground in Iran partnered up with Israeli troops, if it's a 2-week attack or it ends up being a 2-year war, how does this go against his presidential promises? I mean, he rode on an America First agenda.
Oh, it erodes that. I mean, it erodes it. But let me just say also, Maddie, add one more factor in here that none of the media seem to have remembered, because they all when he says he's going to do it, he's going to do it. And I think Caroline Leavitt said that yesterday, the press secretary. Look, in 2000, I think it was 19, the Americans had warplanes in the air to attack Iran after the Iranians had downed an American drone, a Reaper drone. Trump bottled it, pulled him back at the last minute because he got frightened. So it is not clear that Trump would follow through on this. But if he did, then it gets really interesting, because I think I've just said to you, I don't think it's going to be short. I don't think the regime's just going to simply melt away like that. Donald Trump told his base, I will not get you involved in open-ended interventions, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, that happened on the Democrats' watch. I'm not going to get you involved in that. Yet here he is, quite willing to carry out what would be an open-ended military attack. The only thing that I think saves Trump from his position being highly eroded is he's doing it with air power. So in other words, he's not risking putting American ground troops into Iran, but he is risking American ground troops getting hit elsewhere in the region. And if you don't put American ground troops into Iran, can you succeed? So what he does is he doesn't necessarily condemn himself if he goes into this domestically, but he puts himself into a bit of political and military limbo.
What do you make of the narrative that a potential war in Iran is the Epstein war, in the sense that it's a way to distract the public from the Epstein files, stop the truth coming out, and stop the truth of who was involved in Epstein's crimes?
Look, given Donald Trump's ADHD, I think this happens even if there wasn't the fact that Epstein is boiling over at this point and that he's in trouble. So I don't think this is strictly a wag the dog thing. I mean, correct, Maddie, just think about it. In the last few weeks and months, we've had Venezuela, we've had Greenland, we've had tariffs. There's just a different nightmare each day that Trump throws out there for us to try to navigate. I do think that there may be some within the Trump administration who think, you know what, this takes a bit of domestic pressure off of us with Epstein. But you know what, if they think that, I'm going to tell you something else. They're flat out wrong. And the reason for this is Epstein doesn't go away if you attack Iran, because you're now at the point where there are certain legislators who are Republicans, Thomas Massie is key, who will keep Epstein as a priority. And again, when we do our next Trump report, I can tell for you the additional documents that have snuck through, where I think you now have the first evidence, despite the attempt by the Trump people to stonewall this, the first evidence that links Trump to the sexual abuse of Jeffrey Epstein. we'll save that for the moment.
Oh no, Scott, I want to quickly talk about that because I do want to include this article that's come out. So part of the Epstein files in relation to Donald Trump has been making rounds in the last day. So journalist Roger Solenberg, he's been reporting that the DOJ's files used to have documentation related to the FBI interviewing an alleged victim who accused Donald Trump of sexual assault when she was a minor, but these files have now been deleted. So this is the allegation for our audience who are probably following on with the various allegations made about multiple men, but this is the allegation from a victim who claims that she was forced to give Donald Trump oral sex. She bit him, he punched her. So while Trump still is of course, he's not formally accused of any wrongdoing, the question is, why would the DOJ remove documentation of the FBI interviewing this alleged victim 4 times? Not once, but the FBI did 4 interviews with her about this.
You know the answer to that. Why do you think the Justice Department removed a document that incriminated Donald Trump? Was it just simply a clerical error? No. The error was that this document snuck through. And Roger's absolutely superb. When he brought out this report earlier this week, the first thing I went to was just follow the links off of his article where I got to this, what's called the 302 report. Now, this is the FBI record of interview of this victim, this survivor, who at the very least was sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein when she was between age 13 and 15 in the years between 1983 and 1985. Now, interestingly enough, the interview I saw, and I did not know until you told me this, that there were 4 interviews. I knew there was more than one, but I've only seen the record of one. The one interview that I saw the record of is on August the 9th, 2019. Why is that date significant? Jeffrey Epstein died in prison on August the 10th, 2019. So they're interviewing this victim a day before Epstein dies. Now, very quick snapshot of why this sets off red flags for me. Most of the passages that have not been redacted, withheld, are about Jeffrey Epstein. And they are just horrible, horrible cases of sexual abuse that this survivor suffered. But at one point, she tells the FBI that she has a photo of Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump on her phone. The FBI says, oh, really? But before she hands it over to them, she says, look, can I crop Donald Trump out of the photograph? I just want you to see Epstein. I don't want you to see Trump. Okay. Why would she do that? There's another unredacted passage later on where someone talks about the president. And she says, I don't really want to talk about that. Don't really want to talk about that. And the indication here is there may be a fear of retaliation if she does. Because at the very end of the interview, they get to the fact that not just Epstein, but 2 other men seriously, sexually abused her. Horrible sexual abuse. She says she knows one of the men. Doesn't know one of them now, but she says she knows one of the others. But she becomes very agitated at that point and asks to end the interview. And the FBI says, okay, we'll pick this up at another time. My question here is, Maddie, whether we have the 302s for all 4 interviews. Because I do think she would have been interviewed again. And I think that those interviews are going to be very tightly withheld. I don't think we're going to see the 302s on all 4 of them. We may know there were 4 interviews, but we need to see the transcripts of the 4 interviews. What I'm going to tell you at the very least is this. When the Epstein files, when half of them were dropped almost 3 weeks ago, heavily redacted, but half of them dropped, Todd Blanche, Donald Trump's personal lawyer, now Deputy Attorney General, went the next day before journalists and said, there is no evidence here to prosecute Donald Trump, and there's no evidence to prosecute anyone else. Guess what's happened since then, Maddie? Forget Trump for a minute. A guy named Andrew, formerly Prince of Wales, was just arrested, which means he may be liable to prosecution. The name of Les Wexner, the 88-year-old retail tycoon, because of Representative Tom Massey and other legislators who demanded to see some of the files unredacted, his name is out there in terms of his connections to Epstein. A prominent sheikh in the Gulf who was head of DP World the world's largest container company, has had to resign his position because of allegations linking him to Epstein. There are multiple men who could be liable to prosecution for this, not just Donald Trump. But Todd Blanche stood in front of reporters 3 weeks ago and said there's absolutely nothing to see here. I'll take this back to your previous question. Whatever happens in Iran, Epstein does not go away, and it should not go away, because justice for the victims, it isn't here yet, but it should still be pursued.
And we'll be watching to see, and I can imagine Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie will not take their foot off the pedal no matter what happens in Iran. And yeah, just a reminder to our audience, as you mentioned, the former prince known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, he has officially been arrested over his ties to Jeffrey Epstein, whether he shared sensitive information with him when he was working as the UK's trade envoy. This is, of course, a huge deal. We don't know if this could lead to any sort of prosecution. We don't know if this could be, you know, the end of the monarchy. But what we know is, Scott, you know, it's a day that we just wish Virginia Giuffre was alive to see. I think her family have released a statement, so you can go and read that. But Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you very much, Maddie.